Hello, dark sky conversationalists. Is that what you are? Well, can it be a conversation if it's only one way? Well, it wasn't one way when I spoke to our guest today, Dr. John Barentine from America. And John and I have had, a friendship, a relationship for the last 5 years, actually 6 years, when I began the process of trying to create Australia's first dark sky place in the Warrumbungle National Park. So in 2016, the National Park was finally designated as a dark sky place, and we were able to celebrate. And a lot of this was due to the real hard work and passion that John Barentine helped and displayed. He was the project manager for Dark Sky Places with the International Dark Sky Association and walked me through all the process, gave me some tips, looked out for the areas where we might fall over with the application going through the board, and significantly widened my eyes to the whole world of dark skies, which is where I got involved. So John is an historian, an astronomer, but more than anything else, he's a dark sky devotee, and I had the pleasure of speaking with him today. Please join me with John Barentine, Dark Sky Conversations. Thanks.
With a flick of a switch, we turn night to day and day to night. We can change seasons, actions and states of mind. Light is everywhere, used endlessly and very much a part of our modern world. But what is it? How do we use it? And how is it changing our environment and our behaviours? A star-filled sky was once our evening entertainment, but now it's Netflix, iPads, Bluetooth, whatever. When was the last time you looked at the night sky? I'm Marnie Ogg, and this is Dark Sky Conversations, the podcast that brings people and science together to shed light.
I don't do formal introductions, John, because I truly believe that everybody who anybody knows themselves better than I can possibly introduce you. So I guess the question I have to you is, who are you? What have you been doing? And how are you involved with dark skies? Yeah.
I like to describe myself as a recovering astronomer. If I had to give one brief introduction, what's your story? I'm a recovering astronomer. Just briefly to give you a little bit of a background, I kind of started my life in astronomy as an amateur, as a pretty small child, and I have been on this remarkable journey ever since. I pursued that academically. I went through I got a PhD at the University of Texas in astronomy almost 10 years ago, and I lived in the world of professional astronomy for a while. I worked at an observatory, which was a lifelong dream. I wanted to drive big telescopes. Yeah. I worked on a project called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which was in its time the biggest and boldest experiment that had ever been done in the history of astronomy. And to have had the smallest part to do with that was really a high point for my career. And that in a roundabout way is how I came to be involved in dark skies. As I left the academic world, because it's kind of small, there's a limited audience, my heart was always in trying to improve the public understanding of science, because I think it's maybe the only thing that will save the world at this point, and wanting to bring to other people the same sort of just joy and wonder that is involved in seeing a naturally dark night sky, and making sure that people who are here a long time after me have access to that resource. That's what drew me into this. So the gateway in was astronomy, and I hope that in one way or another, I'll be involved in it for the rest of my life.
I hear that quite frequently from astronomers, actually, that, it was maybe not necessarily one particular dark sky night or one interaction, but there was a time in their life that they can remember that they suddenly realized that they were going to be an astronomer because of this experience that they had. Do you have a moment like that?
I do, and if I could remember better, I could probably trace it down to a day. To condense this story, when I was probably about 5 years old, maybe 6. So we're talking a long time ago. I grew up in Arizona. I'm in the United States, and not far west of where I live is a place called Kitt Peak National Observatory, which was our national observatory founded in the 1950s. And it was, in its time, it was really a revolutionary concept in that a government would fund an astronomical research facility to level the playing field for the astronomers of this country, so that it didn't matter what your academic pedigree was. It didn't matter what institution you came from. If you had a good idea for a research project, you could competitively win time on a very big telescope.
So
and
any member of the public, or
anybody who could prepare a winning proposal. And it's a competition-based process. They still allocate time that way. It's still very much a working facility, even though it's more than 60 years into its history now. But that's here in my home state. And I was fortunate to grow up around family who really encouraged me in whatever it was that I was interested in. And my curiosity as a kid and wanting to know everything about everything, putting up with my incessant questions. But in particular, I had a set of grandparents who were very adamant that my brother and I experience as much of this place as possible because it's home to us. And they had a recreational vehicle, and they took us all over this state, from the Grand Canyon up in the north to the border with Mexico in the south, and everywhere in between. And so when I was very little, we went to Kitt Peak, this national observatory facility. And I had never seen anything like it in my life. There are still to this day, quite literally dozens of telescopes on this mountain that's isolated. It's out in kind of the middle of nowhere. And it's overwhelming to know what goes on there at night. And we weren't even there at night. We were there during the daytime. But I remember being so impressed by this experience and the thought that people worked in this place and they did these amazing things. And I said to my grandparents when we left that day, I said, you know what, I'm going to come back here someday and I'm going to work here. And I'm sure they were thinking,
you were 5 or 6, yeah.
And I was 5, and I'm sure they were thinking that, okay, next week you're going to want to be a policeman or whatever. And what kids go through, they have different ideas. And I started reading everything I could find about amateur astronomy, and they kind of ran out of books to give me. And so I came back here to Tucson, the city where I live in now, to do my undergraduate studies at the University of Arizona. And I became involved in research in astronomy for the first time through the headquarters of the same agency that runs the National Observatory. And in my first semester here, I was invited by the staff mentors that I was working with to come with them to the observatory to use one of the telescopes for a couple of nights. And that's like a fulfillment of a dream, right? This is exactly what I imagined. And so we had one night while I was up there, our weather wasn't that good. And so I went down to there's a little kind of a dining hall, library, kind of a common area. And I picked up the phone and I called my grandparents and I said, I kept my promise. I'm working at Kitt Peak tonight. And that was it. I basically never looked back. I never had a thought about doing something else. And it has been such a rewarding experience. And also, I should mention, as a product of public education, which I very strongly support, I think it's important to give back. And that's part of how it became my life's mission to help share this with other people, because I think it's just such a remarkable thing.
Yeah. Sorry, just talking about public educated astronomers, my partner is out there chasing a brush turkey away. So we have these prehistoric birds that are chasing in our background, in our backyard at the moment. So John, you transitioned out of astronomy though, or do you still dabble in astronomy? Where do you find yourself now?
I would say I am an extremely well-informed amateur astronomer. I'm not formally involved in any astronomy research anymore. I've done little bits and pieces here and there around the edges. I wrote a couple of books. I got into the history of astronomy. That's something that's very interesting to me. I might have, if I hadn't gone this route, I might have become an historian. I'm really interested in history.
Mm-hmm.
And here and there, as I have opportunities, I've done some citizen science kind of stuff and some informal involvement in research. But I just along the way decided that it's not what motivated me to want to do it to earn a living. And I think there's an important distinction because anybody who studies the night sky, anybody who takes sort of a scientific view to understanding it, they're an astronomer, be it professional or amateur. There really is a seat at the table for everybody in that respect. So I like to keep up with research results. I read research, read a lot of news stories about it, but I'm definitely on the outside of the academy now.
It is interesting, though. I think that there's a tying up a few things there that certainly I'm surrounded by astronomers, married to one, but there seems to be this groundedness in their approach to the world that I think is perhaps a little bit different from other sciences. And maybe it's because they look at the universe and realize how small we are in it. And yet, as we'll talk about in a minute, how a big impact we're actually making on how we see that universe, or how we're unable to see it, how we're being disconnected from it. But people never lose that fascination for the night sky. Once you've seen it, you can't take it back. It's taking that little red pill or that little blue pill. It's something you can't stop seeing, or you need more of it in some ways. Yeah,
absolutely. And we're fortunate to be able to spend some time thinking about these very big questions. They're the biggest questions that humanity has ever asked. And if we gain just a little bit of knowledge in our lifetime, it's remarkable to crack that door open a little bit and see what's on the other side. And hopefully it changes people's worldview in a sense. People often talk about feeling small as a consequence of the things that they learn about the universe. And I suppose that's certainly an element of that for some people, but I think it's empowering that we can know these things, that the universe is a knowable place. And that the skills that we learn along the way as we try to understand this, we can apply to all kinds of other things. And more importantly, the problems that we face as a society, that we're facing some really big stuff coming up here. And because the world is a knowable place, we can figure this out.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. And I think that's probably people like us who are connected with dark skies. And we talk about it to the public that we get involved with, is that disconnection, that if we're not seeing the stars and if we're not asking the big questions and we're not curious and we don't engage with the cultural histories, et cetera, that have come from it, what is the future? Will we stop asking questions about where we've come from? Will we stop developing amazing technologies that can get us, fly robots to the other side of the solar system, et cetera? And the repercussions of that, really.
It's hard to imagine a future where humans become completely disconnected from those ideas, no matter how challenging things are down here on Earth. It's often said, it's almost a cliche that, humans are by their nature curious. And that's what there's been sort of this feedback effect where curiosity leads to more experience leads to more questions. And that's how we might have evolved our intelligence over time and been better equipped to survive in this world. It's arguable that maybe our intelligence has gotten out ahead of us now, and that for the first time, there's a species on this planet that threatens its own existence, along with the others, and how that could be a little too much of a good thing. I don't know that we'll ever see a time when people just are completely disconnected from this, but thinking about history again and the history of science and how much of what we would now think of as the scientific method in the modern sense was put together almost 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, and was on its way and was sort of extinguished by historical circumstances. And it's not that people weren't thinking about those things, but they were thinking more about other things for quite a period of time in the medieval period. And so
survival.
The progress slowed. Survival in some senses. Differences in culture, and there is no guarantee that the scientific view will prevail. We have seen much of this in the COVID-19 pandemic, with a lot of challenges in dealing with the public and dealing with elected officials, and a lot of what I would think of certainly as unscientific thinking, maybe even bordering on the superstitious. There's not always this constant forward linear progression. And there probably will be times in the future where things slow down a bit. I do wonder what happens, though, if people are increasingly separated from nature, if it causes them to think less about how nature works and wanting to know those things. If we become so absorbed in our day-to-day concerns, things that are very focused on humans and on society, and we lose touch with nature and we become progressively less curious about it, that's certainly a route to a future in which there just might not be as much scientific inquiry as there is right now.
Certainly feels like that. You know, when I have taken people out to dark sky places and have shown them Saturn for the first time, and they look up, and I often talk about this particular lady, and I wonder if she ever heard my podcast, if she'd recognize herself in it. But she was 70 years old, and she looked through a telescope and looked up at Saturn, and she said, "Oh my God, how have I never seen this?" And she was completely moved in that moment. And she said, "I've never really stood outside at night. I've never really done this." So if you've got kids that never do that, and, you know, they don't go through the cycle that you had, where you had, you know, beautiful grandparents that were taking you to explore different places and different parts of life and nature, I feel that people won't ask those questions. They won't be engaged with nature. They're not curious. They don't see plants grow. They don't see sheep and cattle and everything. That they just see beef and lamb chops. You know, it's yeah. Anyway, that's part of the passion that drives me to get people experiencing dark skies, not just talking about them, but actually experiencing them. Yeah, and I guess that brings me to how I know you, John. In fact, I didn't introduce you at all. We you know, I know you through creating the Warrumbungle Dark Sky Park in Warrumbungles, in Warrumbungle National Park. And that was really my first interlude with dark skies. I didn't really truly know, certainly dark sky places and the concept that was driven by the International Dark Sky Association. And you held my hand all the way through the process and made it really a learning experience for me too. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about your involvement with IDA and the dark sky places and what made it so successful, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can you believe that's been 5 years already?
Oh, no, I can't. No.
And it really was, for me, it was one of the major accomplishments of my time with that organization running the program, was to get that first designation done in Australia. That was so meaningful. It opened the door. There are others that have followed you. Australia has such a tremendous resource in the area of dark skies, like few other places in the world do. And I've been happy to see, stories in your media increasingly talking about this, and that the public is generally coming to an understanding of it. When I began my work at the International Dark Sky Association about 8 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing. I was an academic. I didn't have any background in conservation, any of these subjects, and they took a bit of a risk on me. It was kind of a fun story as to how I ended up with that job. It was because of Twitter, of all things. And it was because
must have been the early days of Twitter.
It was the early days of Twitter. I happened to be following the person who eventually became my boss. And there was an ad for a program manager position. And the program to be managed was called International Dark Sky Places. And I didn't know anything about it. I only had a vague sense of what the organization was about and what it did. I knew that it was headquartered here in Tucson, which is a very familiar place to me. I figured I wouldn't mind moving back there. So I applied, and I was asked in the phone interview, could you come to Florida for a week? Okay. Turns out at the time, IDA had a contract with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to do surveys of public beaches on the Florida Gulf Coast and Florida Panhandle They were doing a project to retrofit lighting adjacent to beaches to protect sea turtles. That's an issue in Australia, especially on the Indian Ocean side. Turtles turn out to be very sensitive to artificial light at night. Their conservation status is already threatened by all kinds of other factors. And it turns out that light pollution is something that's pretty easy to protect them against. And so I spent days walking up and down beaches, talking to the people who would eventually become my coworkers. And at the end of the week, I had a job offer. And I thought, I'll figure this out. This is interesting enough to me. I'll figure it out. I had to learn about conservation, which there are people who make careers in that field. I had to learn this subject. I had to pick that up. But it also tapped into some areas of interest to me besides astronomy, besides history. I love law and politics and public policy. Those elements make their way into this as well. And it fits nicely together in the context of this program, which is not only about the places like the dark sky parks, like the Warrumbungles, but it also has a component that focuses on communities, on what we would call the built environment. And it's interesting that we're talking on what is where I'm at is still the 26th of October, just 2 days after the 20th anniversary of that program's first designation in 2001, which was of a city that turns out to be here in Arizona. And it wasn't even a program in the beginning. It was just a one-off recognition of the city of Flagstaff, Arizona, which enacted the world's first outdoor lighting policy in the 1950s to protect astronomical observatories in its vicinity. And they have been doing great things for decades to protect their dark skies. So this city of 75,000 people, and yet you can stand in their city center, and if you're not standing right underneath a street light, kind of block that out, but you can see the Milky Way from the middle of Flagstaff. And to make a model that other people could follow and to recognize this work that had been done there for years, IDA designated Flagstaff a dark sky city. They didn't even have a name for it yet. They just said, you're doing everything that we think is appropriate for cities that want to pursue dark skies, and they wanted to recognize them for that. Well, 20 years later, there are more than 180 international dark sky places around the world. There are multiple categories of designation besides communities, besides parks. They recognize large nature preserves and urban situated parks and protected areas. Again, we need to come at this problem from both sides. We need to protect the places that are dark, but we also need to deal with the source of much of the light that threatens them, and that's in the city environment. And I'm tremendously proud of the work that it wasn't just me, it was everybody in this community, all of the people like yourself, people, the volunteers working on the nominations, helping us shape what the program turned into, helping raise the public profile. As soon as we would designate a new place in a new country or part of the world, within a few days, we would start getting in more inquiries from other locations in those areas as they became aware of the program. And so that's really what started things going. Hey, Fred.
I've got here. Yeah.
I know. And it has really taken off. It has more recognition than ever. It's more popular than ever. And if there's anything that I think will ultimately change the trajectory of dark skies for the better, it's this sense of owning something, of having recognition for doing the right thing and setting these examples for other people to follow.
It's interesting because I hadn't sort of thought about that, the ownership of it, but you're right. So I was involved with the Warrumbungle National Park, and I think that in some ways we had an easy task because the community had already been educated over 20 years of living with the Orana Light guidelines, and that was already in place. But the places, the dark sky places that are aspiring to be designated, have taught me a lot about the fact that, first of all, the biggest obstacle is the stakeholders. First of all, you've got to give them enough information without making it feel threatening to them, and but you're right in saying that they then need to own that. Everybody needs to own it. Every single person who's involved with it needs to feel that this is an identity that they belong to. And in becoming an identity, it is about, it's not just learning the principles or living the principles, it's espousing the principles because you want everybody else to know it. And that's the thing that I think is the element that works so well with dark sky places, is that it does require, the local councils, it requires the restaurant owners, the conservation society. It's not just a conservation group of people that can put this in place. It is much bigger than that. And the local neighbours and everybody gets involved with it. And they start talking about it.
And as they talk about it, other people then say, you know what, I'm interested in that. What does that involve? How can I be part of it? And Marnie, you really kind of put your finger on it. It's that sense of, when we were talking about ownership, we realized fairly early on in the program history that if we wanted to make changes that would persist, we really had to change hearts and minds. And parallel to that was a sense that, sure, we could find the dark places in the world on the map and give them awards for being dark, but it wouldn't give them any incentive to stay dark. And so the program really became oriented around a sense of rewarding the effort that people were undertaking and not just the value or the presence of the resources. And we needed both of those things. And in the case of the dark sky communities and another program category that's now called an urban night sky place, so that's these urban adjacent sort of parks that I was describing, there isn't even a sky quality requirement. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, maybe to call a place like Flagstaff a dark sky community. They do have a dark sky, but there's no reason that Sydney couldn't be a dark sky community, or London or Paris or Hong Kong, or name any big city in the world, because the thinking is you might not start out with a dark sky, but you could get there one day, or you could get closer to that ideal by doing things right. So we wanted it to be partially a reward. We wanted it to be partially aspirational for what these places could achieve over time. But we knew that if we didn't engage people in a somewhat arduous process, it requires commitment and pays back dividends so that they can see the benefits in their regions and their communities over time. We knew that we didn't do those things, that once the initial excitement over a new designation began to fade, that we wouldn't be able to carry it forward in a meaningful way. And I have to say that places that have now been in the program for upwards of a decade are still remarkably engaged in the work, that they don't just kind of set it aside and, here's an award you can put up on the wall next to your others, and you don't really think about it anymore. But they're remaining engaged with the organization, with its advocacy community. They're trying to work on these goals of continuing to improve things so that it's not something that gets set aside and forgotten in short order.
You're listening to Dark Sky Conversations with Marnie Ogg. We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
So that's just the word generation has come to my mind. So are we seeing the next generation of what's the word? Advocates, I guess, coming through, or is that what's happening in these places that have been designated that long?
It is, and beyond. It is the case sometimes that a dark sky place designation made by IDA is the gateway for people to come into this movement. And it's not limited to IDA. It's not limited to one country or one part of the world. It really is a movement of people from all walks of life and all different kinds of places in the world who have something in common. And that's a vision of what the world could be. And so sometimes that's what it is. It's their country has a new dark sky park, and that's a new concept to them. It's something that they've never heard of before, but they're really intrigued by it. And then they realize where the part of the country is, and they say, oh yeah, I remember visiting that place at some point, and I know what they're talking about. And I had no idea. I didn't know that that was something that could be threatened. And they kind of internalize that a little bit, and it becomes a point of pride that their country has a dark sky place. And then they become motivated to get involved and do something about it so that it can stay in those circumstances. And I am impressed by the number and diversity of people who are coming into this movement every year. Diversity in terms of gender and age and cultural and racial backgrounds, distribution in different parts of the world. When the organization started, the movement was, I have to be honest, it was very white, it was very Western, and it was very old guy. And
was that very male? Yeah,
it was very male. It was, it was a concern to a fairly narrow demographic slice of the pie. But it has broadened out so much more than that now, especially as people are seeing that light pollution has connections to things like social justice issues and climate change. It's, as I like to say, there's something in this for everybody, even if your concern isn't astronomy. And there's certainly people in the advocate community who really are completely uninterested in astronomy. It is not their thing. It's not how they came into this. They're interested in one of the many other subjects that it touches on. But I think as they spend time in the advocate community, they begin to see the connections between and among these topics, and how if you learn a little bit about them and you can then go out and talk to the media, talk to your neighbors, talk to elected officials about the subjects, and you can pitch it as something for everybody, it starts to become a win-win proposition in the minds of people who encounter it. And actually, in my experience, it's rare that you have an interaction with somebody who's really never heard about this topic, and you talk to them a little bit, you find where they're at, and you meet them in that place so that it's not threatening or anything like that. And it's so rare to hear somebody say, you know what, I hear what you're saying, and I'm just not interested. I don't see myself in that. I don't think I can make a difference. Generally, the response is more like, I didn't know. Tell me more about this.
You're absolutely spot on that it's so far reaching that it doesn't matter who you talk to, really. In fact, in the sort of 5 years that I've been advocating for dark skies and good nighttime environments, really, because I'm not an astronomer. I can't look through a telescope. My eyes go wonky the minute I look through a telescope and I can't see anything. So that's not what brought me in, or even though I'm absolutely awestruck by a night sky. You put me under a night sky, I'll stand there for hours and look at it. But it is the ecology that's really got me involved, that I really relate to nighttime species and how they're impacted by light. But you're right, there's only ever been in that whole time maybe one person that said, well, what a bunch of rubbish. I don't, everybody else has stood there and lapped up anything, and I could, any bit of information I can give them. But the other thing is, you said it's a win-win. I think it's actually a win-win-win, because it's such an easy pollution to solve in comparison to many of the other pollutants that we've got in the world. And I think that's the other thing that makes it very easy for people to engage with. When you realise that all you got to do is turn your veranda light off at night, and you're making a huge difference. That's very easy to do. It's not difficult. Yeah.
It is, and it has the additional benefit for people that choose to become involved in this, that unlike forms of pollution like air and water pollution, when you stop the source of the polluting, you don't have to wait years or decades to see improvements. And in cases where people have been working on those kinds of pollution, many of them will admit to you, you know what, I may not live long enough to see the results. I'm making an investment in the future. And this is one of those rare cases where there is a potential for instant gratification if people choose to become involved. And I actually hope that where we have these examples of it working successfully, and we do, where we actually made the situation better and we caused light pollution to retreat in certain places, that could inspire people to think, okay, if we can, this seems small, but we tackled it successfully, we can take on bigger things. And I mean up to and including climate change, the things that are really existential for human beings. And I would love people to feel like, yeah, with a concerted effort and the right solutions and the right arguments that we can go and make to people that get them excited about creating this change, and then we can show them that it works when we do all these things, that can get people feeling good about this, instead of what I sense is frequently the case, that people are just overwhelmed.
Yeah.
We are overwhelmed by so much now, and it's easy to feel powerless. I would love to give them a win so that they feel empowered.
And sorry, when you were talking about that, there was this example that we had. We did a launch at the Warrumbungle National Park, and we'd actually been doing talks about light pollution and turtles, and Kelly, the vice president of the IDA, did a wonderful presentation about turtles, but she'd done it on all white slides, and meanwhile the sky had got darker. We'd gone through sunset. It was winter, I think, so it got dark quite quickly. And we turned off her presentation to put on the next presentation, which was about black holes or something. But we had a problem with the projector, and it completely died. And all of a sudden, we went from this artificially lit area, very bright because it was white screen, to complete and utter darkness. And literally, it was the Milky Way was right there in front of us, and all these stars came out instantly. And even with our eyes not adapted, etc. And the audience just went, oh. It was just this gasp. And I said to the crew, don't go on with the slides. We'll just do some naked stargazing here, naked eye stargazing. Not naked stargazing, because that would be wrong. But naked eye.
There are places in the world you can do that. That wasn't the right venue.
Not then. And I think that's what happens, like New York, when the lights went out there, people suddenly start to realize, oh, there is a skyscape up there at night. And yeah. So you've talked about, and we've talked about what goes right with creating these dark sky places, but I'd love to hear about, where people. So for people who are aspiring to create dark sky parks or places or reserves or urban night sky places, what goes wrong? What's the thing that people trip over?
There are a number of them. I think first and foremost is they underestimate what's involved, in the sense of it's hard work. If it were easy, everybody would have done it, and we wouldn't be facing a world in which light pollution on average is growing almost everywhere in the world. It takes dedication. It can take money. That's a challenge in certain parts of the world. If you need to retrofit a lot of lights in order to make your place dark sky friendly, there can be a material cost to that. So that's part of it, certainly. Another big obstacle is a lack of uptake on the part of the public. That requires commitment and dedication to outreach. A lot of people are initially skeptical about this. When you talk about dark skies, they hear dark. Let's be honest, most people are afraid of the dark. Even very respectable adult humans are afraid of the dark. And, for a long time in our history as a species, we didn't have any way of dealing with that at night. And as soon as technology enabled it, we progressively started trying to change night into day out of a feeling that it's more safe. So not being attuned to the concerns that people have, and when they raise those concerns, being able to come up with good answers to them. No, we're not here to take your lights away. No, your outdoor spaces are not going to become less safe at night if you embrace dark skies principles. You're not going to have to worry about a rash of crime or traffic accidents or something like that. That there's a preconception in people's minds. It can be changed. It involves convincing people to think differently about how we use light at night. It can be done successfully, but again, as I mentioned earlier, you have to meet these people where they are. You can't dismiss their concerns. You can't talk down to them. You really need to be aware that for many people, there's very serious concerns, and that people have real fears, but that those fears can be countered with factual information. So outreach. I cannot stress that enough. People that do an inadequate amount of that, if they make too many assumptions about the people in their communities and what their preferences are, what their anxieties are, and they don't target the outreach to where it really needs to go, that can be a problem. And just a sense that because this takes a while to get done, and because it is not easy, there's a tendency for people to give up surprisingly easily if they don't see that immediate result that they'd hope for. And I've always just told them, you really have to hang in there. As with any significant social challenge, rarely is it ever short term and rarely is it ever simple. We have seen definite improvements even in the realm of environmentalism, but it has taken dedication over years. And that people can and often are successful if they hang in there. But they need to know that it's not going to be necessarily easy for them, but the rewards are definitely there for those that are willing to commit to it.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about the word diplomacy. That I think I've learned the art of diplomacy, and as you said, you've really got to meet people where they sit. You and I attended a conference in Scotland. That's probably 3 or 4 years ago now. And I remember hearing one of the advocates for dark skies. So we were all dark sky, advocates in some way, either having created dark sky places or wanting to, or speakers that represented values associated with it. And there was someone in the audience that said that they frequently got opposition from communities because for them, dark skies represented the war. There were periods where the lights got turned off, and this was just something that they felt that they never wanted to go back to. They never wanted to have that repressive feeling. And wow, that's completely foreign to me, an Australian who's never had a war on our grounds, really. And never had the right to light taken away from me.
Right.
So that,
and how do we deal with similar concerns? Maybe not about having light taken away, but about never having light offered. And I'm thinking about the developing parts of the world, especially in Africa. There are some real serious cultural sensitivities there. Just like I would never tell anybody if I encountered somebody in Britain who said, I don't like what this represents because it reminds me too much of a painful time in our past. I would never dismiss that. It would take some creative thinking to how you could turn that story into a good one, and recognizing what people went through. And again, not downplaying the seriousness of their concerns. Sometimes I think we just got stuck with unfortunate language. Dark has such poor connotations. And in certain parts of the world, in the process of managing the Dark Sky Places program, I was asked in a couple of cases whether people in the local languages could use substitute terms. In Germany, for example, they call them starry parks or starry sky parks rather than dark sky parks, especially in Eastern Germany, because if you look at the map of the Earth at night, the eastern half of Germany is not as brightly lit as the West, and that is a relic of underdevelopment due to communism. So the German word for dark is actually something of an epithet in Eastern Germany. And we said, oh no, we don't want to force something on you if it's going to have that. Or here in Arizona, we have a tribe of indigenous Americans who became a dark sky community in 2015. And they said, do you mind if we not use the word dark? Because in our language, its connotation means death.
Oh.
And I didn't know that. And I thought, you know what, for the same reasons, yes, they talk about night sky. They, rather than starry sky, they say night sky instead of dark sky, and it's understood what that means in their language. So that's even the language or the cultural aspect is something where we have to meet people where they're at and understand where their concerns come from, especially if it makes them feel pain or anxiety about where their condition is in life. And we certainly don't want to be seen as taking anything away from people. We have a tendency in the West, driving a lot of the technological advancement in the world, to tell people, we know what's best because we've worked out those things and here they are, and we encourage you to adopt this. And that may not be the right thing for everybody. So if a country in Africa wants to do its lighting in a way that, we might not think is best from our position here in the West as it impacts dark skies, we have to recognize their sovereignty and their ability to make the decisions for themselves. We can't be the ones that come in and tell them everything that they need to do because we're the ones with all the right answers. Rather, I think we have to lead them, hopefully, to make the best decisions for themselves. We need to create that space and make sure that they have the information. And sometimes that means that they're going to make decisions that we don't like. But I think it's the only possibly fair way to approach this work in certain parts of the world.
Well, we've made those errors. We've made mistakes. We've adopted technologies that not necessarily been the right things, and we can only learn from them. And sometimes it's a bit. It is. I have had people say, "Well, why can't we just learn from other people's experiences?" But we don't seem to do that very well.
No, and it's not always a good analogy, right? We think we have a good model, and we find out that it's more difficult in the details than we thought it was. I'm really a believer in that theory that knowledge is power. The more that you know, the more you can figure things out. And it's back to that sense of, nature is this knowable place. But I think even threading the needle with some of these social questions is similar, and knowledge is power. So the more correct factual information that we can put out there will empower people to make better decisions. And I think in the long run, they might end up seeing it our way and say, you know what, maybe we should be careful about how we apply all this light. Maybe, in Africa, we want to build up an astrotourism industry. And so we need to protect the very resource that the tourists are coming to see. Let them make those decisions. And what we can do is be a source of information, be a source of support. But ultimately, as we talked about before, with that sense of ownership, people have to own these decisions. They have to do what's right for them.
I would add to that be a model as well, a role model. So if we're modeling good lighting, and I in fact I was talking to Tim, one of the originators of the IDA, and I remember saying to him, I was always surprised at the number of astronomers' houses that I went to, who would be inflamed by the fact that there were streetlights going through their town or whatever. But yet they had every outdoor light on all night long. So, if you want dark skies, then you have to live by the principles as well.
Lead by example.
So, and just probably rounding this all up, but you're talking about technologies, and this is a very inflaming topic as well, but these satellite constellations, and
oh boy,
we really are inflicting our technologies on the whole globe. I'll let you say as much or as little about that as you want to. I know you're following it and involved with many of the committees that are researching the impacts.
We are changing the world so quickly right now, more in our own time than has ever been the case in the past. And here's another frontier that we're expanding to, which is the use of space. It's not entirely new. We've been putting up satellites for more than 60 years. But for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with this, there is now an effort underway to launch literally thousands, up to perhaps 100,000 satellites into orbit around the Earth in this decade to provide broadband internet connectivity, among other services, to much of the world. And this reminds me a bit of what we were just talking about with how we do lighting in economies that are still developing, and wanting to be very careful about how we frame these arguments. There certainly are good reasons to want to help people in underserved parts of the world gain access to all of this information, because I just said knowledge is power. But if you can't access the information, that's keeping some of the power away from you. And so we're in this conundrum because the satellite presence in the night sky is changing the night sky. I can't underscore that enough. It's not just a case of, it's exciting when you see the International Space Station fly over your city and you can legitimately be excited about that. I am whenever I see it. But looking at the potential for, at any given instant in time, there may be dozens or perhaps 100 or more moving objects in your sky that are just this constant reminder of humans' impact on this otherwise natural space, and what's that is doing to our perception of things. What does it do to people who have cultural or religious needs to include the night sky in their practices? They don't have a seat at the table where these decisions are being made. And I think the watchword that's coming out of all of this is caution. As with a lot of new technologies, we tend to rush into adopting them before we really understand their implications. So I think in this next decade, as this subject is increasingly important, the road we have to determine the course of is, how do we enable commerce in space? How do we bring broadband internet connectivity to the poorest people in the world without damaging a resource that has loomed large in human culture since nearly as long as there were humans? Can we do all of those things? And I think right now we're not equipped to handle it very well. And for me, this is rapidly becoming one of the biggest challenges in the night sky and astronomy in the history of humanity. And unless we change course, we may find ourselves at the end of the decade bewildered by the scale of the change that has taken place.
And there doesn't seem to be any laws or any stop button at the moment. There's no
pressure relief valve. And even though there are laws that govern the use of outer space, the international legal framework, the cooperation between countries that was intended to make it possible to use space in a way that's safe for all the participants, is more than 50 years old and was written before humans walked on the moon. And really, you read that treaty now, and the subtext of it is, who's going to reach the moon first? Will it be the Americans or the Soviets? It has absolutely no forward view that could envision something like this phenomenon of these, tens of thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth. And I think it is just not equipped very well. The way we manage this resource right now just cannot handle this new use of space. And I really hope that this prompts a re-examination of that agreement that the countries of the world made to cooperate and use this space. And also that it serves as a bit of a warning for the future, because of course, as technology continues to evolve, there are future uses of space that we can't even envision right now, but we're going to have to deal with the problems as they eventually develop.
Yeah, well, there's all the questions about mining asteroids and jumping off the moon to Mars, etc.
That's right. It's a brave new world.
Exciting one. So, John, I'm going to round it up now, but the final question really is what are you doing now? What's your what's your mission now?
Well, it has been an interesting past few months, or maybe a year and a half. Like a lot of people, the phenomenon of the COVID pandemic really got me to thinking about life and work and career and what those things mean, and a sense of personal mission in life. And I decided to leave the International Dark Sky Association just recently, after 8 years there, and it was not an easy decision to make.
I bet it wasn't.
Not at all. It was a very thought through decision. I am very much still an advocate. I support what the organization does, and I'm going to continue to be a supporter and continue to work with people in those areas. What I have done is I have started an environmental consultancy here in the US that focuses on dark skies, mainly because there really isn't something like that anywhere in the world right now. And there are very few people who have the inclination and the expertise to do that kind of work. But there's an increasing demand for it. People want expert assistance in whether it's setting a public lighting policy for their community, a private policy for their their corporate campus or their educational institution or any other kind of situation where you would have a lot of facilities that have outdoor lighting, and they need help navigating that. Some of them want to become certified as international dark sky places with IDA, and I happen to know something about that. And it's off to a surprisingly favorable start. When I jumped off the cliff, I really didn't know what I was getting into, but it appears to be promising. I think it will only be bigger in the future. And it's something that enables me to continue to develop my skills, to share with people what I know, to make a difference in the world, and hopefully make a living at it. So that's what is preoccupying my time right now. I have some more free time. I get to do some more astronomy. Even with all of the things in the background that haven't been all that great in the past couple of years, it's really giving me a lot of encouragement about what the future could be like.
Well, fantastic. And I really wish you all the best, because I know how much you cared about, getting the dark sky place through at the Warrumbungles, how much information, how hard you worked for me to help me get that process through. It wasn't just me, it was all of Coonabarra Brown and Fred Watson and everybody else involved. But no, I really wish you all the best, John. And if people want to look you up, where do they go to?
They can find me online at darkskyconsulting.com. And they can find me on Twitter, where I say way too much about way too many things, at the handle @John Barentine.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time. And don't forget, when the borders open up, you're always welcome to come and visit us in our dark sky places here.
Hey, it was so lovely to see you today, Marnie. Thank you for this invitation. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And having never been to Australia, I promise you,
it's got to be on your list. We look forward to it. All right. Thanks. Take care.
Bye, Marnie.
Bye.